Hello, I'm Kelly Hyman, and welcome to Unresolved, the Diddy Cases. Let's welcome Thomas Giuffra, New York-based attorney for 3 of Sean Diddy Combs' accusers. He is also a managing partner at Rheingold, Giuffra, Ruffo, Plotkin, and Hellman. Let's welcome him. Welcome. It's so nice to see you again.
Nice to see you, Kelly. How have you been?
So let's talk about closing arguments. What are your thoughts about the closing arguments?
Well, it was a tale of two arguments, I thought. I I obviously wasn't in the courtroom, but I did read some of the transcripts about what the various lawyers said. And I thought the prosecutor did a very nice job of outlining the facts, not dealing with the emotional components, and just really laying it out on a very legal kind of standpoint where they basically were checking off the boxes of the individual charges. And I thought it was an effective um, summation, and I read it, and I thought it was very good. I thought it was credible. I thought it made sense. It connected the dots to a very complicated case. Now, in contrast, I thought Diddy's attorney did a summation that, for me, I had a hard time accepting that Cassie and Diddy's relationship was one of the great American love stories. I mean, when I read that, I just about fell off my chair because anybody who's seen the video viciously beating her up knows that this was not the great American love story. This was the Ike and Tina Turner story, if not worse. So I thought that was a really going out on a limb, because you as an attorney, you have to think of your credibility. And the jury has to believe what you're saying and accept what you're saying is true. And I thought that one statement really would, if I was on a jury, would take his credibility and throw it out the window, and I would not kind of trust what he's saying. And that's the important thing. If they don't believe you as the lawyer, they're not going to believe what you're saying. So that was something that I thought was a hard point. Now, the things he did do effectively is he's hammering these texts that were not favorable. But then you have to look at those texts in a context. Both of these women were in an abusive relationship. Both of them were treated in a horrible manner by Diddy. And there comes a point where he's trying to put the sense in people, well, why are these women remaining in this abusive relationship? Well, there's a reason why people stay in abusive relationships, not just with celebrities, with ordinary life. And that's because they have financial control, which we've heard of. They have emotional control, which we heard about. And all of those factors cause people to remain in abusive relationships. It happens every day, everywhere. And that's the classic thing that happens in an abusive relationship. And one of the things I thought is when they had the psychologist testify early in the trial about the impact of abuse and why women or men even would stay in an abusive relationship. I don't know if I thought that was too early in the game to kind of bring that out. I think I maybe would have put it on after they both testified, but one would hope, if you have a jury that's intelligent and maybe is a little more understanding of how abuse can impact people and just break down their barriers. I mean, part of it is control, right? So I think if you get a jury that's smart and understands what abuse does to people and how people who would ordinarily not do something are basically battered down into submission, will do whatever their abuser tells them to do, then I think Diddy's got a problem. If they just take this kind of basic view, well, they could have walked out the front door, well, then it's good for Diddy. But I think we've come a long way from that as a society. And I hope, because most of the jury seems like an educated, smart jury. And I think they may be a little bit more attuned to the impact of abuse. I think if this case was tried 20, 30 years ago, it'd be a totally different case because it was a totally different world.
Let's talk about the defense closing argument, and specifically in regards to Jane Doe. Do you think that that was effective?
I don't know. I look at this, I see two battered women. I see two women who were controlled. I see two women who were vulnerable. And to attack the victim is the classic thing in abuse cases, right? But I don't know. It really depends on the jury. For me, as somebody who knows something about it, no, I didn't think it was effective at all. But I'm somebody who's represented victims for 30 years, and I've dealt with psychotherapists and whatnot for most of my career, and I understand what it all means. But for the average layperson, I don't know. So it's a tough one for me to say because, as I said before, we've come a long way, and I'm hopeful that the people on the jury have evolved as much as we have as a society when it comes to abuse.
What about defense argument in regards to the racketeering charges? Do you think that carried much weight at the end of the day?
You know, the racketeering is a tough one, right? Because when we think of racketeering, we're thinking the obvious one is the mobster, the mafia, right? So Sean Combs, I have my thoughts about it. I won't share them, but I think they chose a case. No, I won't. But I think they had chose to try a case that was based around the relationships to make it cleaner. Now, I think maybe the thing that would have been maybe more effective, which would have really fleshed this out, is maybe to expand the net of people who are involved in his empire. And that includes victims, that includes his handlers. Like, I don't understand why his handlers were not brought in to testify. That I don't understand. Probably because they would support Combs, so that they didn't want to do that because they're in it up to their necks. I mean, his chief of staff, she doesn't want to be the next Gisane, so she's going to say, you know, everything. I didn't know anything, right? So I don't know. It's a lot of I don't knows. I think it was a racketeering because he had all his handlers and these people around him who were involved in what was going on, and he was making arrangements things as what was going on. But if you look at the classic example, the basic one that's to me racketeering is he reached Cassie's mother, said, "Send me $20,000, or I'm going to release this sex tape with your daughter." Now, if that's not racketeering, I don't know what is. Right? So that's like what a gangster would do. Now, the other things is they were involved in paying, you know, arranging the flights. They were arranging the people's services. They were arranging for the payment. They're all in the web. And once they're in the web, that makes it racketeering because that's different than Harvey Weinstein. Harvey Weinstein, he didn't have people in his web. I mean, people knew what was going on or had a suspicion that what was going on. But Sean Combs is a different person because he was involving people around him directly in the whole what was going on. Whereas Harvey would just set up his own meetings with people. He didn't really use people in his universe. That's the big difference.
What about the counter argument that no one else is being charged except for Diddy? And in regards to the whole conspiracy, the defense argued that no one testified, even though there was 34 witnesses for the prosecution, that there was a criminal enterprise, that they did this. Doesn't that carry some weight at the end of the day for the defense that there was no conspiracy?
There are people who were clearly involved in taking people across state lines for the purpose of prostitution. So that's a conspiracy. There are people involved in getting drugs and giving him drugs. That's part of the conspiracy. It's very much a more simple view of what a conspiracy is. But everything that they charged him with, you could link somebody in his universe to being part of that conspiracy. He wasn't going out to, you know, on the street and getting his own drugs. He was having somebody else do it for him. He wasn't arranging and paying off these escorts to participate in these freak offs. He was having somebody else do it. So once you involve other people in your nefarious activities, that's when it becomes a conspiracy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but what about the defense argument in regard to the transportation across state lines to engage in prostitution, that in fact they were just paying people for their time? Such as an example would be a porn star who does a movie. They're having sex, but they're not charged with prostitution. They're just being compensated for their time.
I don't think they were being compensated for their time. I think that's a bit of a tough argument. Um, there are laws that prohibit prostitution in, I think, just about every state except Nevada, if I'm not mistaken. So that in and of itself is you can't pay somebody to engage in prostitution. Once you go across state lines, that makes it a federal problem.
Do you think the charges for the sex trafficking, Cassie, Diddy's ex-girlfriend, and Jane, who's going under a pseudonym, Diddy's ex-girlfriend, one is stronger case than the other?
I think that Jane is a little more problematic because he's still paying for her lawyers. He's still paying, which kind of makes no sense to me. So I don't fully understand. So does he still have a hook in Jane to control Jane because he's still paying for her lawyers? I don't know. It's when I heard that, I thought that was pretty strange. I think the Cassie claim is stronger because her emails were, or texts rather, were stronger. And of course you have that video. And that video is very compelling evidence, I think, for a jury because it showed a very vicious person. I mean, when you see that, you can't unsee it and say, well, this is a nice guy, he's a family man in his little Bill Cosby sweaters. You're not seeing that. You're seeing a guy who's brutally beating up a woman. And when you see a guy who's brutally beating up a woman, I think it's an easier jump to make mentally to think he'd be involved in pretty horrible things.
But to be devil's advocate, he is not charged with domestic abuse. And so
No.
just because he did that does not mean that he's guilty of the sex trafficking, the RICO, the transportation.
No, it doesn't mean he's guilty of that. It doesn't mean he's guilty of that at all. But when you have testimony that they didn't want to engage in these activities, and the reason they did is because they were afraid of getting physically harmed, you can see in that video he's capable of delivering on the physical harm. So it's a real concern, or in the heads of these women, that he can deliver if you don't play ball with him.
So it sounds like you think that potentially, as I call it, a mixed bag, guilty on some, not guilty on others, hung jury on some. What are your thoughts on which one of the counts do you see most likely to be found guilty on, and which one do you think that maybe they could be hung on?
This is just my opinion. I was not in the courtroom for the whole trial. I haven't seen any of the evidence. And remember, here's something else to think about. We don't know what's shown in those videos that were shown to the jury. So there might be some really unpleasant things in there that we don't know about. So that's a tough one too, because there's a big piece because they showed a bunch of videos, but we don't know what they show. And what I noticed is the prosecution didn't seem to really address the videos. And I wondered in my head why. So that's something you should put in the back of your head because we don't know what's shown in those videos. So it's a great unknown. But I think the sex trafficking charges, I think he's got a problem there. I think he's got a big problem there. I mean, there was coercion. There were some of the emails seemed pretty threatening to me. There was force. We have the video. We have Cassie's testimony. We have Jane's testimony. So that one I think is one you could hang your hat on pretty well. Transportation over state lines for the purposes of prostitution. I mean, that's the old man act basically, and that's I think is pretty easy. I think that's, from what I've read, the people who are in the criminal justice system far more than I am seem to think that was one of the stronger counts. I think the most challenging one is the RICO statute, and the reason I think that is because the RICO statute in and of itself is very challenging, even for somebody who's a lawyer to kind of understand what it means. So that's the one I think is the most challenging. but I think the sex trafficking and the transportation are, I don't want to say easy because there's no such thing as easy in a courtroom, but I think they're the stronger cases just because it's more clear cut. It's not because when you see these, when the judge reads these charges, they just go on and on and on and on, and it gets confusing. And the jurors can very easily lose the plot on the RICO. But to understand that if you bring somebody over state lines for commercial sex purposes, that's trafficking, that's kind of more easy to get. If you force somebody to engage in activities they otherwise wouldn't get into, that's sex trafficking. If you coerce them by saying, hey, look, I'm shutting you off, you're not going to have a place to live, you're not going to have a roof over your head, that's coercion. So, and you have that here based on what I've heard. I mean, again, qualifying, it's just what I've heard and what I've read. But I think those are the two stronger cases. I mean, the thing with the drugs, yeah, I mean, that's something you can hang your hat on. But if you want me to give my handicap or what I think are the two best, I think those are the two best claims.
So my prediction is guilty on the transportation across state lines to engage in prostitution. As to the sex trafficking, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, as to Cassie Ventura, yes. As to Jane Doe, no. And as to Rico, no. But we're going to have to see what happens.
Well, you know, I agree with you on everything you just said, but I think the RICO, I think I give it a hope. So I feel like we're on the same page because I think the Cassie one is clearer than the Jane Doe. And the Jane Doe situation, like I said earlier, is kind of weird that he's paying her lawyers and he's still kind of in his web. So that one's a little problematic for me too. But I think she's got a good one. I mean, 20 grand, or I'm going to release these sex tapes, and mom pays him the 20 grand. If that isn't proof of coercion, I don't know what is, right?
Some would say extortion.
Well, some would say extortion, yeah, but that's such an ugly word, and I wouldn't want anybody to question me about using that word. But I think telling somebody to pay me $20,000 or I'm going to release a tape on the internet of your daughter being, effectively sexually abused for all the world to see, I think that's pretty coercive behavior.
We talked before about the implications of your cases representing alleged victims of Diddy and this trial. Now that we're at the end of it, is there anything further that you would like to add of the implications of this criminal trial to the cases of your alleged victims? I
think it really doesn't tell us any more than we already knew. I think where it's important to the criminal cases is important as to the civil cases is if he's convicted. And part of what, the defense has been is that everybody's lying and it's a cash grab. In fact, Cassie's after a cash grab. Everybody's after a cash grab. So if he's convicted, that's going to be a tougher argument to make. And it's going to be a tougher argument to say all these people are lying about him and they're just on the cash grab money train. This was different than other cases I've handled because the attacks on the lawyers, I thought that was a lot different. And I think the aggressive nature of how they approached the denial, I mean, usually there's a blanket denial, we disagree, we'll prove it, have our day in court and prove these people are all making things up. But that's one thing. But this was much more aggressive. But if he's convicted, it's real tough to take that position because him being charged, that doesn't get before a jury. Him being convicted and being convicted of felony, that gets before a jury. And that will be something the jury can consider in assessing him, assessing his credibility, and assessing the individual cases against them.
Does it matter which of the charges he's convicted of? So if he's convicted of the sex trafficking rather than the RICO is better in your cases, or does it matter at all?
I think a felony is a felony. And I think if it's a felony related to sex trafficking or if it's a felony related to sex abuse, I think that is helpful for the people who are bringing claims against him. I think it would definitely not be helpful if he's found not guilty.
So the verdict's back, and Diddy has been found guilty on the transportation across state lines to engage in prostitution. Are you surprised?
No, not at all. Not at all. Well, it was obvious. I mean, he arranged for prostitutes to go to different areas to engage in his freak-offs. He paid them for the services. It wasn't like they were going for, a cup of tea. They were going there to do one thing, to do a job, and they were brought across state lines. I mean, the Mann Act, which is what this is basically, is one of the oldest, sex cases or laws that we have in this country. So when you bring somebody across state lines for sex and you pay them, you're going to have a problem.
Is there anything else that you like to share with our viewers?
The one thing I think that is important is I think we as a society are going to learn or become more knowledgeable of the impact of abuse. And one of the facts that I like to throw out there, because it's a published fact, is only 15% of abuse cases or rapes occur with strangers. The overwhelming majority of physical abuse and rapes occur when the survivor is in a relationship or knows the abuser. That's just a fact. It's a complete myth that most of these cases involve somebody who's following some lady walking home from work late at night. It's usually somebody they know or they're in a relationship with. And if we have a greater understanding of the impact of abuse, and again, not my area, but and you could probably get a psychotherapist to explain it far better than I could, we'll understand things better. And hopefully women or men, because men get abused too, will know that there's some way to get out of these situations, and there's steps they can take to protect themselves, and they can get that piece of justice. Because one thing I've seen as somebody who handles these kind of cases is the trauma sits on the person's back for their life.
Thank you so much, Tom, for your time and your wisdom.
All right, Kelly. Nice to see you as always.
Let's welcome former prosecutor, TV legal analyst, and star, Marie Pereira. Welcome, Marie. It's so good to see you.
That was overly hyped, but I'll accept it all. I'm good.
So let's talk about the Diddy case. Closing arguments. What are your thoughts?
You know what? I think the defense did a good job at trying to just water it down and saying, what is the big deal here? We have a guy and a couple of women who like kinky sex and they were getting it on. Why are we judging and coming into people's bedrooms and criminalizing baby oil, Astroglide, and videotaping action? What's the problem here? And that's basically the crux of the defense's defense. And I think they did a good job at bringing that across, hoping that there are some liberal jurors out there who engage in some freak-offs in private and wouldn't criminalize it.
Well, there could be some conservatives that have an alternative lifestyle as well, potentially, right? Just doesn't have to be liberals. Or do you mean like a liberal kind of like an open mindset?
I mean an open mindset. And funny you should use the word conservatives. Those are the ones who you have to be afraid of because they get freaky in the bedroom, but in real life, they act like, they're conservatives. And those are the ones, if you have people like that on the jury, who will be quick to convict because they hate what they do in private And so they just will say, oh, it's so wrong. But in reality, they're the ones who are using the most Astroglide and baby oil around. It could happen.
So, as a woman, what are your thoughts on defense argument that Cassie and Diddy was a modern day love story?
As a woman, I think it's a little bit of a stretch, but I want to say, let's, can we make me a woman criminal defense attorney? Or do you just want me to be a woman? As a woman criminal defense attorney, I could say that Cassie knew exactly what she signed up for. And it was a modern romance. She was 19 at the time. He was almost 20 years her senior, and he was a music mogul, and she was an aspiring artist. And she saw him as her way to climb up every social circle that was relevant to her at the time. And so when he brought it up to her that, hey, you know, I like watching my woman have sex with other men. I like to videotape it. It turns me on. She made that decision to say, okay, I will do that for you because I love you. And she did it because she wanted to keep his affection and she wanted the fame. She might have not been 100% okay with it, but there was nothing here that involved sex trafficking, coercion, and things like that. That's what I would say as a woman criminal defense attorney. But as a woman, I am not here for that. On a personal level, I don't do that kind of stuff. I'm strictly conservative when it comes to intimacy, and I would have said, hell to the no.
You would have said basically you're out.
I'm out. I'm not here for it. No kind of fame would make me want to do that. I couldn't do it as a woman.
As a former prosecutor, did the prosecution do a good job on the closing argument?
They did. They did because although they didn't put on a case, and although they did drop kidnapping and arson, which really was not a good look for them, because if you indicted based on those two predicate crimes, and then you presented your entire case, you brought witnesses in to justify the crime and the elements, and at the end you volunteered to drop it, it makes me look like you went through all of that and you didn't prove those charges. So in the eyes of the public and the jurors, it looks bad. But overall, they did do a good job at presenting the crime, the elements, and using witness testimony they had to justify that Sean Combs committed those acts. I think a lot of it is going to have to do with the moral fabric of the jurors. If, like I said, they're conservative people, not in the sense of politics, but conservative in their lives, they're going to look at it just like the prosecutor set it down. This is the law, and he did this, this, and that, so therefore he should be convicted. But if they're liberal, they're going to look at the totality of the circumstances. They're going to look at the integrity of the witnesses, the moral fiber of the witnesses before they come down to a decision. So hopefully the jurors will stick to the black and white letter and say, yes, there was trafficking. People got on planes, buses, or however you brought them to you. There were acts of sexuality, right? A lot of it. You did videotape it. There were people working for you, and you told those people who the drug dealers were, where to find them. They brought drugs to you, and you distributed drugs to different people, right? So that's the drug part. You did try to bribe people not to show that videotape. That's the bribery part. If you look at it that way, black and white, and not right, left, totality, then yes, they did a good job at presenting their case.
Do you think the prosecution proved the racketeering conspiracy beyond a reasonable doubt?
No. And I said earlier on another podcast, if the RICO doesn't fit, you must acquit. I think it was a lot. Because when you think racketeering, you think, you know, The Sopranos. You think big kilos of things in the back of trucks, and you think people going around shooting people in the head, telling them shut up. That's what you think. You don't think that Rico is Puff Daddy having a fetish for watching his women have sex with other men and buying drugs that everyone voluntarily, allegedly, um, took. Nobody was forced, tied up, or drugged, or got a needle in the arm under protest. You just don't think that those activities add up to RICO. It just sounds like an overreach, an exaggeration, and that could be a problem for the liberal jurors. It just seemed like a lot to me.
Why do you think it would be a problem for some of the jurors?
Because to accept that it's RICO is to accept that if you or someone like Puff Daddy or someone like me and you who occasionally, smokes weed, who takes Percocets. People are out here doing drugs and functioning just well in our community. We don't know who they are because they're not advertising it, but people are out here doing that. And people are out here having all kind of freaky sex, tying each other up, saying, kneel on your knees, let me beat you up, give me a safe word, choke you. Like, people are doing that. So to accept it is to be criminalizing activities that other people do in the privacy of their own homes and turning it into like a big RICO sensation criminal act. And I think for some people, it might be an overreach.
Do you think it matters from the juror, like someone like me that's never done that stuff or never done drugs, that that's going to impact their ultimate decision and their ultimate verdict?
Yes, it may impact it. If it is people who don't engage in that type of activity, whose sex lives are very traditional and conservative, one-on-one in privacy, maybe an occasional astroglide, but nothing to the extent that Diddy did it. And they're quiet, peaceful, loving, sexual people. It could be so shocking to them that they buy into the RICO. It depends. But on the other hand, you could have people who say, you know what, I don't buy into it, but I think the government is overreaching and going into this man's house, seizing his baby oil. I thought that when they raided his house and then they took a few months and then they had an indictment, I thought the things that they seized would prove the RICO, the sex trafficking, uh, the drug use to an extent where it couldn't be denied. I thought they seized computers where they had, you know, videotapes of people passed out and other people violating them where they clearly couldn't give consent, having sex with people who looked like they were drugged. I thought they had more than just the testimony of those two or three women, Mia, Jane, and Cassie. That's all they had. I thought they had something more than just that. I thought they had even minors on video. For them to bring the magnitude of those charges, I was disappointed that it was the testimony of three women who he knew intimately, who came in to say, I said yes, but then I changed my mind for the most part, at least with Cassie and Jane. I don't know. I just thought it should have been more evidence of trafficking than that.
So, do you believe that the prosecution proved that Cassie Ventura was a victim of sex trafficking beyond a reasonable doubt?
I want to say yes because of the video. For her, the video of her coming out of that hotel room, him running down the hall in his towel, knocking her down to the floor, kicking her and then grabbing her by the hair like a rag doll and then just disappearing inside the hotel room. That video was extremely impactful, even though you can't say, you're using the video to show his propensity for violence because he wasn't charged with domestic violence. It shows the level of coercion and threats she must have endured, because look at what he did to her in that video. So for Cassie, even though I believed for the number of freak offs she had, and I don't remember how many, some of them were consensual. But just because one time or two times or 20 times she gave her consent doesn't mean if she didn't give it one time, he should not have adhered to her saying no. So all she has to prove is one time I said, no, I don't want to do it, and he coerced me into taking drugs, or he threatened me with violence. He threatened me with releasing the tapes that I had done willingly before. And I was so afraid of him through threats and coercion that I continued to do it. Continuing to do it is still a crime. So his lawyers are arguing, oh, she's been doing that. All of it was consensual. I believed her testimony when she described instances where she really didn't want to and then justified her doing it because she feared him. The video says it all for Cassie. Jane, not so much, but yes, I believe the prosecutors proved it for Cassie if the jurors believe it. And again, you have to have jurors who empathize with her, maybe people with their own daughters, people with history of maybe being with narcissists and people who've been abused. Jurors are people just like all of us. They may believe her because that part, I believe she made her case for, I didn't want to do it all the time. And there was a time when I wanted to end it and I couldn't because of coercion, threats, and that cancels any type of consent.
What about the counter argument that she could have left at any point in time, that she made a decision to be with him, to stay with him, and ultimately that was her choice?
It's a good argument for the defense, but at the end of the day, I think the prosecutors preempted that by bringing in the forensic psychologists who explain trauma bonding, who explain why victims stay. And again, for Cassie, the videotape as well explains why she stayed. She was afraid of that. Look at what he did to her. And then she gave testimony of other instances of extreme violence against her, almost in public. One instance was when she was on the plane and there was broken glass involved, and his staff was on that plane. They heard her screaming and crying, and they saw him standing over her with a broken glass in his hand, threatening her, and she screamed, is nobody going to do anything? So with Cassie, one could say she stayed because of that. And she had independent corroboration of the violence, not just the videotape, which we can't unsee, but other instances where his personal assistant who was on the plane verified that happened. So with Cassie particularly, she did justify why she stayed, and it wasn't because of fame and fortune. It was because she was afraid of him releasing those tapes, exacting more violence against her, and maybe even making her disappear because he was a powerful person in his universe and she was nothing.
She was something, but not as powerful as he was in the music industry. I don't want to in any way negate her as a woman, but from a power play in regards to being a music mogul, then he definitely had the upper hand, so to speak.
What I meant to say is In his world, he made her believe through the manipulation and the violence and the sexual degradation that she was nothing, to the point where he was ordering another man while videotaping and directing to urinate on her and in her mouth. She testified she was gagging on urine. So he made her feel as if she was nothing. He made her fear for her life and her safety. So in his world, he controlled her by making her feel like she was nothing.
Let's talk about Jane, Diddy's ex-girlfriend, who is using a pseudonym. Do you believe the prosecution has proven beyond reasonable doubt that she was a victim of sex trafficking?
No. In opposition to my feelings on Cassie, yes, they have a chance of proving that because of her age and all of what I just described. But for Jane, who is an older person, who's a mother, who has an OnlyFans page, who has no independent corroboration of the violence she describes against her, who had a personal assistant to Mr. Combs, who had befriended her, come in and testify that to prepare for the hotel nights, Jane called them, Jane would direct him to go out and get beautiful, sexy heels and clothing and lingerie to please Sean and to please the men who were coming. And then afterwards, when he was tasked to clean up the rooms and the hotel rooms, he would see her still in there. She would not look upset. She would not look like somebody who had just been violated by 3, 4 men against her will. Before, during, or after, she participated in the entire thing. And there was no one who came in, unlike Cassie, to verify the violence that she described. The only instance of violence that I remember listening to during the trial was when the escort Anton was supposed to pull up at the house. She had an argument with Sean prior. She called him a pedophile and a bitch. And then she mushed his head, and then he turned around and he unleashed terror on her, chasing her into every room. This was at her house that he rented for her somewhere in California. And he kicked down doors, and then the escort rang the doorbell. He tried to choke her, had her in a choke. She was dangling, fighting for her life. And then when the escort came, he said, "That's Anton. He's at the gate. Go get him." She drove out of the gate or to the gate in her own vehicle. He didn't go with her. And mind you, prior to that, she said she experienced violence against her by Sean Combs, strangulation, punching. She had a knot on her head, contusions on her neck from the attempted strangulation. She drove to pick up the escort, came back, didn't say a word to the escort about what had just happened. She put on her clothes and then she disappeared into a bedroom and allegedly had sex with the both of them. So her story was not corroborated like Cassie's story of violence. So for that, I would say Jane's testimony was not as impactful in terms of her being an unwilling victim of sex trafficking by Sean Combs. She looks like she was a part of it. I was in the courtroom at one point in the overflow room when she testified. So I didn't get to see her face to face, but I saw her on big screen. And she was cross-examined rather effectively. And they asked her, did you tell the escort what had happened minutes before? No. I hid my injuries with my hair. They even asked her at some point, did you orgasm? And she said, no, but I faked it. They asked her, why didn't you leave? She said, because I relied on him to pay my rent. They broke it down. Didn't he, over the 3-year period you were with him, give you about $150,000 in cash, Zelle, wires? And she said, yes, but I took myself off the market for him for 3 years. and I had more bills to pay than that. And then she ended the cross-examination with her saying, don't you think I'm worth more than 150K? It was a mic drop moment for the female prosecutor. And she said, I have no further questions, Your Honor. So she came across on cross as a gold digging adult woman who made choices which included having sex with 3, 4 men in front of Sean Combs, having him videotape it, and then their quiet time, movie time, would be playing back the videos, and then he would be very affectionate and reward her for participating in this thing that he really needed for his sexuality to bloom. I felt no compassion for her like I felt for Cassie Ventura. And if I were a 13th juror, that testimony would not have me checking off sex trafficking as it pertained to her.
Talking about transactions and how that's interpreted, do you believe the prosecution has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that there was transportation across state lines to engage in prostitution?
Yes, because those people who were hired and chosen by the alleged victims of the sex trafficking reached out to those escorts and paid money for them to come and have sex. It's simple as that.
The jurors have come back and said that Diddy is not guilty of racketeering conspiracy. Are you surprised?
I'm not surprised because I felt it was an overreach from the beginning.
Are you surprised, as I say, a mixed bag, that the jury made a determination on some counts and then made a different determination on other counts, so they didn't find him guilty of all counts or innocent of all counts?
I'm not surprised because they, in some instances, looked at the totality of the circumstances. So there were some instances where they believe there was no consent because there was just too much violence, as described and corroborated by some of the witnesses. And then they looked at some of the witnesses and said, you know what? I don't think that this woman was coerced. I don't think that this person was forced to go out and get drugs. I don't think that this person was kidnapped and held against her will. That's why they dropped the kidnapping. I don't think that there was arson because nobody ever directly connected him to the arson or that he paid someone to do it. There was not enough. So the jurors looked at it and they used what I call CSE evidence, common sense evidence, and they chose what they felt the people proved beyond a reasonable doubt. And for those portions of the crimes that they felt the prosecutors did not prove, they went half and half, partial, and they did what they thought was right.
Is there anything else that you think our viewers would want to know or should know about this trial?
Wow, that's a good question. I think, you know, we live in a society where people do anything for money and fame. I think this was a mixture of criminal activity, but it didn't start out that way. I think that the government did overreach in bringing it to federal court under RICO. I think if there weren't issues of statutes of limitation and they did it in state court, did an assault, rape, like a DV case, and they had cooperation of the witnesses who claimed the violence, it would have been better. I think bringing it to federal court under RICO was a lot, and that's what I would have done differently. You know, it just was a lot under that particular statute.
Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate your insight and expertise, and I look forward to being on a panel with you again.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Kelly Hyman, and thank you for watching the final episode of Unresolved, the Diddy Cases.